Okay, great. Yeah, so one of the issues I wanted to talk about today, having dealt with some of this, is whether buying and selling a Bitcoin for cash is legal or illegal in the United States. And so, you know, what do people really need? Step back and think a little bit about what people really need in terms of a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin or another currency like Nexus. Um, what we really need, right, is something to facilitate our trades and allow a broader exchange of goods than can be met by barter. Because, of course, when you're doing barter, you need to actually find somebody who has what you want and they're willing to take what you have, right? And so the purpose of a currency is really to intermediate between these two and allow a store of value. So that's really fundamentally the purpose. And after barter, right, one of the earliest things people used to do this was gold, which was very useful because of the existence of touchstones. In other words, it was discovered that there are these kind of stones where you can rub the gold, the putative gold, against it if you're going to accept the gold for something of value, and sort of see whether or not it actually is gold and relatively pure gold. And so that made gold very useful as a medium of exchange. And of course, that changed over the years, right? And one of the early roles of government in facilitating exchange was basically certifying the purity of these substances like gold, right? And so these are pictures of Roman coins, which were circulated very broadly in the ancient world. And people relied upon the fact that, look, if that's imprinted in a way that corresponds to a Roman coin, then this is probably actually the gold and in the amount that was intended. Now, of course, the government being a monopoly, this eventually gets corrupted, right? And in almost every single case in history where the government has gone to paper money, the government is just unable to avoid the tendency to want to inflate that paper money. And in fact, we're seeing that now with the US government, right? The Federal Reserve, which I guess 25% of the dollars presently in circulation were actually minted in the last year in 2020 because of all of their stimulus spending. So Bitcoin was designed really to provide something as an alternative to that, right? As a distributed ledger of value. Essentially, all people really need is the ability to keep track of who owes what to whom, right? That's in a secure manner. And Bitcoin was really designed to be a way of doing this that was beyond the control of government. And I just want to note here that, I say Bitcoin, but really I mean all cryptocurrencies, including Nexus and any of those that are, have a distributed ledger. But I'll just say Bitcoin for convenience during the course of this presentation. So, the original vision of Satoshi really was that Bitcoin would be used to buy and sell goods and services, right? And that everybody would run this program on their computer at home and have a copy of their ledger and would use it to keep track of their trades. And actually, the first pizza trade, right, which is sort of a famous one in the Bitcoin community on May 22nd, 2010, was not really of this form, right? It was really somebody arranging to use a regular credit card to purchase pizzas that were then sent to someone, and that person then sent Bitcoin to them in exchange. The first place where you could really buy something concrete directly for Bitcoin was for alpaca socks. And in fact, this was mentioned in Slashdot that Grass Hill Alpacas was a company that made alpaca socks and had alpacas, and this family decided that they would make their socks available for Bitcoin back in 2011. And it gave rise to this very funny phrase, right, that Bitcoin users initially might have been described as alpaca sock wearing crypto terrorists. But in the interim, when you can't buy everything you need for Bitcoin, right, there's a need to basically get in and out of the legacy financial system. And early on, very few businesses taking crypto. So you needed to exchange currency like USD for other cryptos, right? And so this gave rise to the exchanges that could go between Bitcoin and a regular bank and regular dollars. Now, if you think about it, of course the government is going to want to control this process, right? Because if this really works, let's think about the kind of power that the government will lose if people could suddenly just trade entirely using Bitcoin and never go through the Federal Reserve. First of all, they wouldn't have the power to inflate, right? They couldn't just automatically turn around and try to print a bunch of money. And in fact, we're in some sense already seeing that in one sense, you can look at the increasing value of cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin as sort of an inverse graph of the value of the US dollar. And so they lose, in a sense, the power to inflate. It also considerably weakens their power to tax, because if you can use anonymous cryptocurrencies and so on and make your transactions anonymously, it becomes much more difficult for the government to track, oh, you got this kind of income last year, and therefore, you owe us this amount. The other thing is it makes money laundering easier. And by money laundering, of course, we mean these laws that were put in place, right, to prevent the use of money that arose from other crimes. Now, why did the government do this? Well, this is money laundering is a relatively recent crime, in a sense, in the latter part of the 20th century. And it's because, of course, they tried to prohibit other things like drugs and so on, and were very unsuccessful in that, right? Their drug war has been really a complete failure. And so they thought, well, if we can't actually win at that, we'll expand it, right? And we'll try to make it illegal to use the money that comes from these things that we don't like, instead of being able to enforce the actual crime. But also, again, if you can use an anonymous cryptocurrency, and certainly early on, I think nowadays the vast majority of use of cryptocurrencies is for legal purposes, in excess of 95%, I think. But early on, probably a lot of things had involved some degree of money laundering, or was used by people who are otherwise engaged in these what the government calls illegal activities. Now, I want to, as I start talking about these legal things, note that I'm not a lawyer, right? I'm a neuroscientist, but having lived through some of this, I had to learn an awful lot about it, so I can talk to people from my knowledge base. So, but exchanges then, if you're going to have these businesses that are exchanges, they can be the legal choke point, okay, between how cryptocurrencies are used. And any business is obviously easier to control than individuals, right? Because the business has property, it's in a centralized place usually, and it's much easier then to sort of use that as a choke point. And we see that also, right, amidst the pandemic now. We see that with, if you want to have a mask mandate, well, it's pretty pointless to tell people they have to wear masks, but you can tell businesses, if you don't require people to wear masks, we're going to come and do something to your business. And of course, they already have these money transmission laws that they can then try to apply to exchange. So in order to think about what constitutes a money transmission and whether it might fall under money transmission laws, and whether the government can use that as a choke point, what about a normal cash sale? Like, say you sell your old laundry machine for cash, right? Some guy comes by and he says, okay, yeah, I want that washing machine. I'll give you $50, and he gives you $50 in cash. Normally, we think of that as a two-person normal cash sale. But what about if you're selling Bitcoin for cash, right? Okay, so now you've got this property, the Bitcoin, okay, and you're selling it to somebody for cash. How is that different from, say, selling your old laundry machine for cash? And is that a form of money transmission to make that kind of sale? Now, if you ask most people, they will tell you, no, that's just selling Bitcoin for cash is just selling a piece of property that you own for cash. Okay, it's not something that's money transmission. But this obviously creates a huge problem with trying to control exchanges, right? If exchanges are simply involved in buying and selling some property, namely, some cryptocurrency for cash, how do you control them then under the money transmission laws? You're going to have to somehow either call that money transmission, define it as money transmission, or define a new law. And it's important to realize in trying to resolve this ambiguity that there's a sense in which Bitcoin was actually designed to create precisely this issue, okay? It blurs the line between a currency, a commodity, and some tangible piece of property. And so government agencies, in a sense, still haven't really figured that out. In fact, in the US, we have 3 government agencies, right? The Securities and Exchange Commission, tax people, and commodities regulators, all of whom are sort of fighting over whose turf is this. Okay, what really is this thing, a cryptocurrency? So how does the federal government try to control these cash sales? Well, first, in order to think about this, let's look at this little diagram, right? What really happens in a cash sale for Bitcoin, concretely speaking, in terms of physical reality, right? You've got the buyer here on the left, and you've got the seller here on the right, okay? And basically, the buyer is going to give some cash, these US dollars, okay, over to this seller, okay, on the right. And in return, what does the seller do? The seller actually communicates to the buyer a signed transaction, which they can then essentially redeem on the blockchain, right, or to other people. Now, the normal way this is done is with a cryptocurrency wallet program or something, but in fact, you could actually give somebody written down on a piece of paper, the hex codes for a signed transaction, and exchange that for cash if you wanted to. So it does not necessarily have to involve the use of the internet or these wallet programs. And so that's really the thing of value that's being communicated for the cash is the signed transaction. So how does this fit into existing money laundering laws, federal money laundering law, or federal money transmission laws? Well, the primary statute is 18 U.S.C. 1960. And it says the following, that, it talks about money transmission and that you can't run an unlicensed money transmitter business. And it says the term unlicensed money transmitting business means a money transmitting business which affects interstate or foreign commerce in any manner or degree. And then it gives 3 different clauses. Well, if you're supposed to be, A says if you're supposed to be licensed by the state to be a money transmitter, then that's also a federal crime if you didn't do it. And then there's C, which says if you are involved, if you are transmitting funds that are known to have been derived from a criminal offense or intended to be used to promote or support an unlawful activity. So in other words, if it's money laundering, not only is it the crime of money laundering, which is a separate statute, it's also a crime under 18 U.S.C. 1960. But B says fails to comply with money transmitting business registration requirements. And then down at 2, it says the term money transmitting means transferring funds on behalf of the public by any and all means, including but not limited to transfers within this country by wire, check, draft, facsimile, or courier. Notice it doesn't say by giving somebody a signed cryptocurrency transaction. It doesn't say that there. Okay, and so in some sense, this does not really directly apply. Okay, read literally. Okay, so the important question is: does that prong B, the requirement to be registered as a money transmitting business, apply to a cryptocurrency for cash transaction? And if you ask most people, they'll say no. That the statute here doesn't say providing a piece of paper with a signed transaction on it, right? It says a wire or a draft or something like that. Okay, I don't know. Maybe you could argue it's sort of like a check. Okay, but most people think of this as more like selling your washer for cash. Okay, and the legislature, actually, the federal legislature has several times has revised this law since 2009, since the advent of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, and they have actually. You can look back at their discussions in the course of the legislation. And they have explicitly refused to clarify or modify this to state that it includes a cryptocurrency transaction, which suggests that the legislative intent is not to cover cryptocurrencies as a form of money transmission. However, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, run by the federal government, has been asked now about this and how it applies. And people began asking them pretty early on, actually, about the legality of Bitcoin transactions. And in 2014, so they issued guidances when they are asked questions. And in 2014, they actually issued this particular guidance known as FIN 2014 R002, which entailed a business that was going to operate a website. And on the website, they would, in fact, buy and sell cryptocurrencies from their users. And this guidance said explicitly, quote, to the extent the company purchases and sells convertible virtual currency, paying the equivalent value in legal tender, all exclusively as investments for its own account, it is not engaged in the business of exchanging convertible currency to other persons. So that doesn't sound very different from a peer-to-peer trade. I mean, if I'm doing this as an individual, just cash for some Bitcoin, it seems like that certainly falls under the idea that I'm just doing this on my own account and I'm exclusively doing it with just some known, some specific counterparties. So, but despite the fact that that's the guidance in 2014 R02, federal prosecutors love to argue that 18 U.S.C. 1960 does in fact cover such trades. And in fact, in the case U.S. versus Costanzo in 2017, you can look, it's online, and docket entry 165 footnote 1 on page 4 says that the prosecutors stated that this was their opinion. So the federal prosecutors in the District of Arizona have stated whether or not Arizona licenses Bitcoin exchangers, the separate federal FinCEN obligation under 18 U.S.C. 1960 B2 requires licensure for a person in the defendant's position, as well as for any other person who exchanges Bitcoins for cash as a business or for any profit motive. Okay, so this is the prosecutor's very far-reaching interpretation of 18 USC 1960, despite the fact that the law doesn't really clearly state that, okay? And this issue has actually never been adjudicated by a judge or jury. Perhaps somewhat surprisingly, given that Bitcoin has been around now for over a decade, there's never been a ruling by a judge or jury on whether 18 USC 1960 explicitly covers this kind of peer cash to Bitcoin trade. Now, you miss this sometimes in the Bitcoin and the cryptocurrency press because there's been a lot of pleas down for money laundering. So there's been a lot of people who have been involved in some degree of money laundering, and the penalties for money laundering are much more severe than for a violation of 1960. And so a lot of times what happens is if the case is at all arguable or perhaps defendable, the money laundering case, what the prosecutors will do will say, look, if you plead guilty to an 18 USC 1960 violation, we'll let you go and we won't charge you for money laundering and your penalties can be lower. So most people end up taking this deal. So there's a lot of plea bargains down to a guilty on 18 USC 1960, but never an adjudicated case by a judge or jury on whether it applies. Now there's some what are called dicta, which are not official precedents stated by the court, but there are some dicta in older cases which probably bear on this question. So there was a case, U.S. versus Banky in 2012, which involved basically the transfer of cash through the Hawala network, basically family friends from Iran, and whether that was illegal under some prohibitions of transfer to Iran. And it referred to an older case, U.S. versus Velastugi, in which the court stated, a money transmission business receives money from a customer and then, for a fee paid by the customer, transmits that money to a recipient in a place that the customer designates. So in other words, there has to be a third party involved. And so in general, it seems like the legal interpretation should be sort of what's shown in this diagram, that you have basically a person who is selling, okay, or wants the money transferred, okay, and pays the cash plus a fee, okay, to an exchanger, to a third party that's in the middle. So it's very hard to see how this language in U.S. versus Velastugi can apply to a two-party trade where there's no person or business that is receiving the money from a customer and then sending it to a recipient, okay? So that might be one way to argue about the legality of this. Now, FinCEN itself actually has been explicitly asked in two recent written requests to clarify this issue of two-person cash peer-to-peer trades, and has refused to do so, actually. These requests have been outstanding now for probably one of them for more than 2 years, and FinCEN has never responded, and they are under no legal obligation to do so. And actually, a former director of FinCEN who was hired as an expert in a case, opined that they probably actually don't want to do so, that they don't want to take a position on this, other than their 2014 guidance. And that they don't internally, apparently FinCEN does not like that 2014 guidance and the way it was written, because it seemed to imply that as long as you're buying and selling your own property and not basically trading somebody else's property, you should be legally in the clear. But you know what? Prosecutors love this ambiguity. Okay, they absolutely love it. And actually, they write articles about 18 USC 1960 about how it's wonderfully broad and it can be used for all sorts of purposes to catch the people that they perceive as bad guys. And one of the things I've learned in being involved in this is, you know, it turns out, right, there's a very broad penumbra, if you will, of activity around actual illegal activity, okay, activity that's clearly illegal. There's a broad penumbra of activity that borders on it that the prosecutors can use to get probable cause, okay, and say, well, look, judge, this looks an awful lot like it could be this. And that's all they need in order to seize assets and then turn around and make deals to keep part of them, okay? They don't need to convict you under the civil asset forfeiture laws. All they need is to convince a judge, okay, that they have probable cause, that a reasonable person would think that a crime has probably been committed. That's what probable cause is. Once they have that, they can seize all the assets that arguably are related, okay, and hold on to them until you can prove, okay, that they're actually legally your assets. And the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, actually has handbooks on how to size up the victim, essentially, of their extortion, right? And make an offer that will maximize the take. So their handbooks say, well, look, figure out how much the person is worth, how much it'll cost them to defend the case, if it's an arguable case, and then offer to drop the charges in exchange for basically an amount of money that's just a little bit less maybe than what they would have to pay to defend the case. And so almost no rational person is going to turn that down, because yeah, you could go to trial, right? And you could fight them, okay, but you might be convicted and then be stuck with a very long prison sentence, whereas instead you can get out and just let them keep some of the money they seized. So, in summary then, looking back at the laws, you can ask, is selling Bitcoin for cash legal? And is the answer yes? A lot of people say yes. A lot of people say no, right? And the true answer is no one can really say for sure, okay, with the present legal situation, because we don't have any actual precedent, okay, at the federal case level where there's been an adjudication by a judge or jury of whether 18 U.S.C. 1960 covers those kind of transactions. If you want to stay on the safe side of all this, become a licensed money transmitter, okay? It's not that expensive in some states. Some states it becomes much more expensive. It depends a lot on whether the state requires you to be a money services business or not. It creates a lot of paperwork and a lot of reviews. You have to, gather some paperwork for the feds, basically, and keep it in your records if you're selling the Bitcoin, so that they can go back presumably and trace who it is. The other factor, of course, is that that's not really what Bitcoin was meant to be, in a sense, in terms of, of being a licensed money transmitter. So, but it's important to recognize, if you come on the prosecutor's radar for any other reason, okay, they will use this to extort you. They love to do this, okay? The prosecutors actually hold awards dinners, okay, for those who rake in the most money out of civil asset forfeiture. So, all they need is probable cause. If they can get a probable cause that you've committed some federal crime, they can then seize all your assets that are even vaguely related to that activity. Okay, the judge will let them do that. And now they hold them. And now you have to bring a civil case against them, actually all parties are suing the property. It's an old thing that comes from maritime law. So basically you have to sue the property to get it back under those circumstances. And so they know that. They know that's an expensive process. And so they'll oftentimes make a deal. We'll drop these criminal charges. We'll let you have most of your property back, but we're going to keep a portion of it. And then they're enforcement thugs, essentially, at the DEA and the IRS. You have to realize these people are very dangerous bad people, okay? Extremely dangerous bad people. They look forward to breaking down people's doors, okay, and pointing guns at people. They like it, okay? And they brag to their cohorts. I mean, they're on, there's plenty of recordings out there about them bragging to their cohorts about, gosh, I had the chance to shoot and kill somebody. Or I wish I had a chance to shoot and kill somebody during these raids. So these guys are really very, very dangerous people that you don't want to be messing with. So be extremely careful. It's true that probably smaller deals not involving illegal activity are unlikely to suddenly rise to a level of interest that a prosecutor is going to say, oh, I want to, go get that guy who just sold $3,000 worth of Bitcoin. I mean, that's not likely to come on their radar screen. It's when the amounts get larger, okay, or people become very public about this, that people tend to be on the radar screen of these very dangerous people. So in summary, then I'll just close up here. It's still really unclear, in a sense, if cash for Bitcoin trades done in a peer-to-peer manner without being a licensed money transmitter are legal under federal law. Smaller trades are unlikely to raise ire. But if you get this wrong, certainly the consequences are very severe, and you'll hear about that in the next talk by Thomas Costanzo. So check with an attorney specializing in this area if you need to be sure. So that's pretty much what I have to say about the subject.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Peter. We had just one question from the community. Are you open to answering?
Sure.
The question is, what is your perspective on the SEC's investigations into LBRY? LBRY. LBRY. It's
oh, right. Yeah, I have not looked into that case in particular, so I can't really comment on that. But this is an example of the fighting that we have going on, right? So is this a security? And so the Securities and Exchange Commission should be involved, or is it just property which the IRS can tax? Or, or is it a stock? And, it's just everybody's trying to sort of get into the act, is my opinion. And I don't know that there's going to be any clarity on that, frankly, I think, until either the courts really rule much more definitively about this, or until the legislature steps in and actually passes some laws to clarify exactly how this sort of property needs to be treated.
Brilliant. Okay. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives and your knowledge. It was really interesting listening to you.
Oh, well, thank you. Okay, and my pleasure. And you guys have a good rest of your afternoon in the meeting.